This video and everything ANGELSPIT does is made possible by our amazing Patreon supporters. Remember to check out ANGELSPIT's Patreon. It has loads of new content and exclusive content and rants by me. In this video, I talk about MIDI. I give a brief history on it and explain how I use it, or try to use it. MIDI is being replaced by USB, which is much faster and much better. So much of this might not be relevant to new synths, but since my synths are stuck in the 80s, we're just gonna go with what's relevant. MIDI completely sucks. It's a total compromise. It's an example of how a committee comprising of the world's best synth manufacturers got together to design a racehorse, but instead compromised and made a camel. It's ancient technology, which, when it was originally released, was already ancient, redundant technology. I won't bore you with the history of MIDI, you can Google that. However, I will mention that several major synth manufacturers were fighting to make their own musical instrument communication system the industry standard. David Synth from Sequential Circuits, who's a fucking genius, had the best idea. It was a fast data rate which was robust and could handle many different channels at the same time in parallel, meaning it could simultaneously send a whole bunch of different commands down different wires, hence parallel. However, it was the slower, clumsier idea which won, cause ain't that life. This inferior interface sent digital information in series.
I'm listening.
No, not Siri, series.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, fuck off and die. Meaning it sent one piece of information at a time down the same wire, which made it even slower. And it won because it was the major corporations that pushed it. So once again, VHS beats Beta. The camel triumphs over the racehorse. And that's why MIDI, the industry standard, completely sucks. Plus, technically we are still on MIDI version 1.0. I'll say that again, we are technically still on MIDI 1.0. Updates have been suggested, but not officially adopted. Yup. Synths, drum machines, samplers, they all talk to each other using the speed of an early 80s data communication, which is completely useless. And even at the time it was released, it was complete crap. Yes, I have anger issues about this. My first experience with MIDI was in 1986, when I connected my beloved Casio CZ3000 to a friend's synth. I could play his synth and mine. I could stack both synths together. I got this huge sound. It blew my mind. I was considered the MIDI nerd at university. I lectured classes in MIDI and music technology. And no one in my classes learnt a thing. But they were entertaining, kind of like how my Blitverts are pure entertainment and they're not informative at all. What? MIDI has become my best friend in the studio and also my worst enemy. Once again, I'm not going to go into depth on this. There are a zillion videos on YouTube about how MIDI works. A standard musical instrument has 3 MIDI ports: in, out, and through. In is for incoming MIDI information. So it's listening and it's playing what it's being told to play. It listens for note on, note off, which note to play, how hard it was played, pitch bend, controllers, modulation wheel, sustain pedal, all that kind of stuff. Fun fact, the technical term for a synth that obeys and does not speak is slave. I'm serious.
I'm listening.
Shut up! Out is for outgoing MIDI information. So it's talking and telling other instruments what to play. It's telling the slaves information like note on, note off, which note, how hard it was played, pitch bend, controllers like modulation wheel, sustain, pedal, déjà vu. Another fun fact, the technical name for a synth that speaks and tells other synths what to play is master. Through passes the MIDI information from the input straight to the through port. So everything that comes to the MIDI import is passed to the MIDI through port. It's kind of like a mirror. This is really handy because you can connect your master synth device to the in of your first slave. Then from the through of your first slave, connect that to the in of the second slave. And so on and so on and so on. This is called daisy chaining. However, there's a noticeable delay after about 3 synths. This is because MIDI is so slow and total crap. MIDI sends and receives over 16 MIDI channels. So this cable sends and receives over 16 MIDI channels, in and out. If a synth is set to receive on MIDI channel 1, it will only listen to information on MIDI channel 1 and ignore all other 15 channels. You can tell the synth to listen to several channels, like 13, 14, 15, and 16, or on all of the channels. You might have a bass sound on channel 1, a synth sound on channel 2, a pad sound on channel 3, and drums on channel 10. Most synths can have separate independent sounds on each channel. Each receives its own notes, pitch bends, and all that stuff. They act like individual separate little synthesizers within the one physical synth. Some synths can only receive on one channel. Usually these are older synths or monophonic synths. Some musical instruments will send on specific channels. It can be one channel or many. It all depends on the synth. The K2000, for example, can split its keyboard into 3 zones. Each zone can broadcast on a different MIDI channel, which is awesome. For example, the bottom octave can broadcast on channel 1, the next 2 octaves, they can broadcast on channel 2, and the top 2 octaves, they can broadcast on channel 3. MIDI uses a 5-pin DIN cable, but it only uses 2 of those pins, pin 4 and 5. The other pins are completely redundant, so DIY wiring is super easy. Interesting point, of the 2 pins used, only 1 is used for the actual MIDI signal. That's pin number 5. Pin 4 is plus 5 volts, which is used to power MIDI through boxes, which is kind of redundant now. MIDI can send a constant clock signal which syncs all the timing devices together. This will help keep drum machines in time, make delays fall on the beat, and sync arpeggiators to the master sequence. This is called MIDI clock. It also sends start, stop, and reset signals plus song position, so it can track which bar your song is up to. It's a digital version of Roland's analog sync. For some weird reason, MIDI clock does not work in my studio. It might be the computer or the patch bay. It's a mystery and a total pain. So as a result, I just use really old school analog clock sync because I know it's reliable. Plus, I think analog clock sync is way more in time than digital MIDI sync because MIDI sucks. I have 3 main modes of operation: studio, live, and messing around. Each of these modes require the synths to be patched together differently, which is why I need a MIDI patch bay. I use a Motu MIDI Express XT. It works most of the time. Sometimes it drops its memory and patches get corrupted. The Motu MIDI Express XT is a USB MIDI control center patch bay thing. Thank you, Shaya. It takes the input from 8 sources or cables, synths, drum machines, sequences, and routes them to 8 output sources via MIDI cables, and that can be a synth, sequencer, drum machine, coffee maker, whatever. Remember, each input and output is running 16 channels, so that's 128 channels in and 128 channels out. Confused? It gets crazier. It also generates 8 sets of MIDI channels from the computer, so it can generate 8 sets of 16 channels. That's a total of 128 channels. All outgoing, all speaking MIDI, all the time loudly. The cool thing about the MIDI patch bay is that it has 8 user memories. I have 1 user memory for each mode of operation. Each synth in the studio is physically patched into the back of the patch bay. It's plugged in there. This patching never changes. The studio mode is the mode I use while I'm making music. It looks like this. The computer talks over 8 sets of outgoing MIDI channels. That's a total of 128 channels. The patch bay converts this into actual MIDI language and sends it out the MIDI ports. That's my cat. Each of these sets of 16 MIDI channels are hardwired to a MIDI output on the back of the patch bay. The main master keyboard in the studio setup is the KeyStep. Interesting note, the KeyStep Pro stays in sync with the computer via USB, but only sends or speaks information via CV gate. Really? Where was I? Via CV gate and MIDI clock, which is the old language of analog synths, because a lot of the gear I use uses pre-MIDI voltage communication. So in that way, it's absolutely fantastic. Wouldn't you say? Don't you love stepping on it? The live jam mode is when I am making music live. It looks like this. The K2000 is the master controller. It can send or speak MIDI over 3 different channels. One channel controls the BeatStep Pro, which in turn drives a whole bunch of the old analog gear. Plus, it also drives the Emax rack, the Dark Energy via MIDI. Another MIDI channel controls the analog thingy, which is a technical term. The KMI 12-step also controls the BeatStep Pro, because sometimes you run out of hands and you gotta use your feet. I can also use it to play chords on the Emulator 4. Wow, that's kind of complicated. And yet, that's the simplified version. I think this is why I write really angry, frustrated music, because I'm so angry and frustrated in the studio all the time my whole life because MIDI never really works. Messing around mode is when I am sampling or having fun. It looks like this. K2000 talks to everything. Simple. I use this mode when I'm programming samplers and synths and fun stuff like that. Side note, so just to make things even more confusing, the Emax keyboard is not connected to the Motu MIDI patch bay because they don't talk to each other. Sometimes I need to dump samples onto the Emax via MIDI, which is another really cool thing about MIDI. You can actually dump sample sound audio data onto a sampler. To do this, the sampler and the computer need to hear each other. It's called a handshake. Don't do it. Don't do it. She's doing it. But the Emax and the MIDI patch bay won't shake hands. The computer's main audio device has got a MIDI patch bay built into it, so the Emax and the audio interface will talk. They shake hands, everyone is happy. It's kind of ironic that MIDI was born out of a whole bunch of manufacturers fighting with each other. And now, like 40 years later, they're still fighting with each other, and it's just as ferocious. You need to plan out which synth is going to talk to which other synth, who's going to talk to who's going to talk to what. You also need to have the flexibility to change the routing, as live routing is usually different to studio routing. Plan it out on paper and draw all the little lines between the synths and the drum machines, like who needs to talk to what in all the different versions. Get a patch bay that will handle your MIDI cables and routing. Otherwise, it will turn into spaghetti. Because all those cables going everywhere, it's just going to turn into total spaghetti. And you need room to grow, because you're going to have more chaos and more spaghetti. Also, seriously, get yourself a pair of knee pads, because you're going to spend a lot of time crawling around behind your units and your synths, trying to figure out what the hell is going wrong, because MIDI sucks.